On the morning of August 16, 1944, SS Oberstgruppenführer Paul Hausser held a piece of paper that defied the laws of physics. He stood in a damp concrete bunker near the village of Fontaine-le-Pin. Outside, the sky was grey and heavy. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and fear. Hausser was 64 years old. They called him Papa. He was the father of the Waffen-SS, a man who had lost his right eye to a Russian shell fragment outside Moscow in 1941. He was a Prussian officer of the old school, disciplined, aggressive, and utterly loyal to his orders. But the order he held in his hand, transmitted directly from the Wolf's Lair, almost 1,000 miles away, was insanity. "Hold position," it read. "The 7th Army will not retreat. It will counterattack." Hausser looked at the map table. The reality on the acetate overlay was a death sentence. He commanded the German 7th Army. On paper, this was a terrifying force of 100,000 men, and the remnants of 4 panzer divisions. But in reality, they were trapped in a pocket barely 15 miles wide and 9 miles deep. To the north, the Canadians were hammering down towards Troon. To the south, the Americans of the 15th Corps were pushing up from Argentan. To the east, the vengeful Polish 1st Armored Division was closing the only exit. Hausser did the math. He had 100,000 men, he had thousands of vehicles, and he had exactly 1 major road and 3 dirt tracks to get them out. If he obeyed Hitler, his army would die where it stood. If he disobeyed and ordered a retreat, he had to push an entire army through a gap narrower than a city block, while under fire from 3 sides. Hausser crumpled the telegram. He made the only decision a rational soldier could make. He ordered the retreat. "We move tonight," he told his staff. "We must reach the Dives River before dawn." The retreat began in a deluge of rain. By the afternoon of August 17th, the roads leading to the town of Chamboise were a parking lot of the damned. This was the reality of the Wehrmacht in 1944, stripped of its propaganda gloss. Alongside the fearsome 60-ton Tiger II tanks of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, there were thousands of horse-drawn wagons. The German army was a bizarre hybrid, a 20th century armored head attached to a 19th century logistical body. Panic was beginning to set in. The men of the 277th Infantry Division were exhausted, their boots rotting on their feet. They marched with their eyes fixed on the sky, terrified of the Jabos, the Allied fighter bombers that ruled the daylight. Every time an engine was heard overhead, the entire column would freeze. Thousands of men diving into the hedgerows. Major Hans von Luck, a commander in the 21st Panzer Division, drove up and down the line in his Kugelwagen, shouting orders, trying to separate the tanks from the horses, trying to keep the blood flowing through the arteries of the pocket. "Keep moving," he screamed. "If we stop, we die." The tension was physical. You could smell it. Sweat, wet wool, hot oil, and horse manure. They were waiting for the air attack. They were waiting for the screech of rockets. But 10 miles away, inside the Fire Direction Center, FDC, of the US 15th Corps, there was no mud. There was no screaming. There was only the quiet, methodical work of calculation. This was the cold side of the war. American artillery wasn't an art form. It was an industrial process. Inside a large canvas tent, rows of men sat at drafting tables. They weren't warriors in the traditional sense. They were accountants of destruction. They wore clean uniforms. They drank hot coffee. They used slide rules and logarithm tables. While Hausser was screaming at his tank commanders to clear a bridge, an American lieutenant named Parker was calmly plotting coordinates on a grid. "Target area 44 Bravo," Parker said into a telephone. "Crossroads east of Chambois. Concentration of enemy armor." He didn't look out a window. He didn't see the enemy. He only saw numbers. Azimuth, 4,200 mils. Elevation, 380. Charge, 5. The American system had solved the biggest problem of artillery: time. In the German army, each battery calculated its own firing data. It was slow. It was personal. In the American army, the FDC centralized everything. One brain controlled 100 guns. They treated the battlefield like a factory floor. The German soldiers were just raw materials to be processed, and the machine was hungry. Every day, the Red Ball Express, a continuous conveyor belt of trucks, delivered 20,000 tons of supplies to the front. For every shell Hausser's tanks fired, the Americans could fire 50, but volume wasn't the weapon. The weapon was synchronization. What Lieutenant Parker and his team were preparing was a tactic known as time on target, TOT. This is the moment where the war changed from a contest of wills to a physics problem. To understand why Hausser's army was doomed, you have to understand the mathematics of instantaneous convergence. Here is the problem with traditional artillery. Battery A fires. The shell travels for 30 seconds. Boom. The enemy hears the explosion. They realize they are under attack. They dive into foxholes. They button up their tanks. Battery B fires 10 seconds later. Boom. But by now, the enemy is safe underground. The surprise is lost. The killing potential drops by 90% after the first shell. General Hausser knew this. His veterans knew this. They counted on that 10-second window of survival. It was the rhythm of their lives. The Americans decided to remove the window. Inside the FDC tent, Parker pulled out 3 separate fire tables stained with coffee rings. He was working backward from a specific moment in time. The question wasn't, when should we fire? It was, when must each gun fire so everything arrives simultaneously? Battery A, 155 millimeters long. Toms positioned at grid 22 November. Distance 12.4 miles from target. Flight time of a 155 millimeter shell at that distance, accounting for muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, air resistance coefficient, and ballistic curve. 48 seconds exactly. Battery B, 105 millimeter howitzers positioned at grid 31. Charlie, distance 4.3 miles from target. Flight time of a 105 millimeter shell, 18 seconds exactly. Battery C. 8-inch heavy guns positioned at grid 44 Delta. Distance 8.1 miles from target. Flight time of an 8-inch shell. 35 seconds exactly. If all 3 batteries fired at the same moment, the shells would arrive sequentially. Useless. 18 seconds apart. The enemy would hear the first, react, and survive the second and third. But if the FDC issued precise firing times, calculated backward from a specific impact moment, let's call it 1400 hours, then the convergence became possible. Parker worked the calculations. Battery A must fire at 13:59:12 to arrive at 14:000. Battery C must fire at 13:59:25 to arrive at 14:000. Battery B must fire at 13:59:42 to arrive at 14:000. This required a synchronization of watches that had never been attempted in human history. Every morning, American artillery officers synchronized their wristwatches to the second, using the BBC time signal or a master radio pulse transmitted from Corps headquarters. A deviation of 2 seconds was considered a failure. 2 seconds meant an error radius of approximately 1,200 meters at the target. Useless. But the Americans had invested in precision. Each artillery officer carried a Bulova or Elgin watch, synchronized to within 1 second of atomic time. The ritual was solemn. At exactly 6:30 hours, the BBC broadcast the Greenwich Mean Time pips. Officers held their watches to their ears. They adjusted the second-hand fraction by fraction. The margin for error was 1 pulse, 1 heartbeat. This was the invisible mathematics of American precision. While Hausser thought in terms of tomorrow and next week, the American FDC thought in terms of 13:59:12 and 13:59:25. Inside the FDC tent, Parker wasn't alone. Around him sat junior officers with slide rules, calculating azimuth corrections for wind, temperature adjustments for barrel expansion, and charge variations. The 155mm long tom could fire charge 3 through charge 7. Each charge variant required its own firing table. Charge 5 gave 48 seconds flight time. Charge 6 gave 44 seconds. Charge 7 gave 41 seconds. The FDC had to decide which combination of charges and firing times would converge on target 44 Bravo at exactly 1400 hours. It was a 3-dimensional puzzle. Not just distance, not just time, but the vertical dimension as well. The shells had to arrive not just at the same moment, but at the same altitude, creating a cone of destruction that no soldier could escape. But there was something else Parker wasn't calculating. Not yet. He was calculating where to fire next, after this barrage, and the barrage after that. Because the TOT wasn't a one-time tactic. It was a process. A rhythm. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of continuous bombardment, use periodic TOT volleys. Fire once, reload, wait 5 minutes, fire again, at a different grid square, with a different convergence time. The enemy couldn't dig in, couldn't fortify, couldn't predict. They could only watch their grid square and pray. In the next tent, Major Williams was reviewing the ammunition supply line. How many shells could 15th Corps sustain? The Red Ball Express delivered 20,000 tons per day to the front. Of that, 8,000 tons were ammunition. Of that, 3,000 tons were artillery projectiles. That was 30,000 individual shells per day, assuming an average weight of 100 pounds per shell. If the TOT strategy required 3 barrages per hour, with 300 shells per barrage, that was 900 shells per hour, or 21,600 shells per day, within the supply capacity. More than sufficient. While Hausser was screaming at his tank commanders to clear a bridge, an American lieutenant named Parker was calmly updating a logistics spreadsheet. Shells on hand, 47,000. Shells on the Red Ball Express, 18,000. Shells in production at stateside factories. Infinite. Hausser's tactical problem. How do I get my men through that gap? Parker's strategic problem. How do I make sure no men make it through that gap? Hausser was thinking battalion level. Battalion movements, company tactics, platoon level survival. Parker was thinking system level. Production schedules, logistics chains, convergence vectors, and casualty rates. One man with a radio transmitter. One man with a slide rule. Both trying to solve the same problem. But from opposite ends of the war. Hausser would lose, because his problem was impossible. He had 100,000 men in a 15-mile pocket, with only one exit. Parker would win, because his problem was already solved. He had 48 guns, 300 ammunition trucks, and a watch synchronized to the BBC. What Hausser didn't know was that this wasn't even the beginning. This was just the artillery. Behind the artillery was the Air Force. Behind the Air Force was the Navy. Behind the Navy was Detroit. The 7th Army was facing more than 15th Corps. It was facing the entire American industrial system. And that system had decided that the Falaise pocket would cease to exist by August 21st. When the order fire was given, it didn't look like a movie. It wasn't a simultaneous roar. It was a staggered, confusing ripple of noise across the countryside. To a German observer on a hill, it would sound lazy. A pop here, a thud there. But up in the stratosphere, something terrifying was happening. Hundreds of steel projectiles, weighing between 30 and 200 pounds each, were converging in a 3-dimensional cone. They were traveling at supersonic speeds. They were outrunning their own sound. Back on the road near Troon, Paul Hausser wiped rain from his good eye. It was quiet. Too quiet. The Jabos had gone home due to the weather. He saw a column of his men stopped at a crossroads, eating cold rations. They were relaxed. They hadn't heard a firing gun for minutes. There was no whistle of incoming shells. That's the physics of supersonic flight. The shell arrives before the sound. Hausser checked his watch. It was 1400 hours. In 1 second, literally one single second, 3,000 shells impacted the crossroads. It wasn't a bombardment. It was an erasure. The physics of a time-on-target strike create an overpressure wave that acts like a solid hammer. The air itself became a weapon. Inside the target zone, the pressure spiked so aggressively that lungs ruptured instantly. Eardrums were shredded. The window of survival that Hausser relied on did not exist. There was no time to dive. There was no time to shout. One moment, a soldier was eating bread. The next moment, he was simply gone. And then came the second innovation. The VT fuse. For years, artillery shells exploded when they hit the ground. If you were in a foxhole, you were safe. But American scientists at Johns Hopkins University had placed tiny radio radars inside the nose of their shells. These variable time fuses sensed the ground and detonated the shell exactly 30 feet in the air. Hausser watched in horror as the forest around him turned into a wood chipper. The shells didn't hit the mud. They exploded overhead, raining jagged steel straight down. The foxholes became open graves. The trenches became traps. The mighty Tiger tanks, with their thick frontal armor, were useless against 155mm shells exploding directly above their engine decks. The radiators were shredded. The crews were concussed by the shockwaves ringing the tanks like bells. The panic was absolute. This was steel psychosis. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had fought in the ruins of Stalingrad, broke down and wept. They could fight an enemy they could see. They could fight a tank, but they couldn't fight math. The road to Chambois became known as the Corridor of Death. It was no longer a retreat. It was a slaughterhouse. Drivers abandoned their trucks and ran blindly into the fields, only to be cut down by the next TOT volley. Horses, maddened by the noise and shrapnel, stampeded through the columns, crushing the wounded. The river dives ran red, literally red, with the blood of the 7th Army. 10 miles away, the American gunners were sweating, stripping to the waist. They were firing so fast the paint was peeling off the barrels of their howitzers. Check fire, the radio crackled. Barrel temps critical. Keep firing, came the order from the FDC. Pour it on. Trucks from the Red Ball Express were backing up directly to the gun pits, dumping fresh crates of ammo. They didn't even bother to stack them. They just shoveled them into the breaches. In 24 hours, the 15th Corps fired 80,000 rounds into an area the size of Central Park. It was the greatest concentration of artillery fire in the history of warfare. On August 20th, the mathematical inevitable caught up with Paul Hausser. He was moving with the remnants of his staff near the banks of the Dives, trying to coordinate a breakout with the 1st SS Panzer Division. He was on foot, or perhaps in an open vehicle. Reports vary. He was trying to be a soldier. He was trying to lead. But the American FDC didn't care about his rank. They only cared about his grid square. Target, 55 Charlie. Time on target, 16:35:00. The air split open. A piece of shrapnel, hot and jagged, tore through Hausser's face. It shattered his jaw and lodged in his shoulder. The commander-in-chief of the 7th Army went down in the mud, unable to issue orders, unable to speak, bleeding into the same earth as his lowest private. Around him, his staff was decimated. Hausser was hauled onto the back of a tank, some say a Stu G3 assault gun, and strapped down like a piece of luggage. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, looking up at the grey sky, he saw the end of the Third Reich. He wasn't seeing a defeat in battle. He was seeing a bankruptcy proceeding. Germany was bankrupt of steel, bankrupt of fuel, and bankrupt of time. He was carried out of the pocket. A broken man, leaving behind a broken army. By the time the firing stopped on August 21st, the 7th Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 10,000 men lay dead in the corridor. 50,000 surrendered, marching in endless grey columns towards the Allied cages. But the material loss was the true verdict. 500 tanks and assault guns destroyed, 7,000 trucks abandoned, and 20,000 horses, their bloated bodies filling the air with a stench that pilots claimed they could smell from 2,000 feet. When General Eisenhower toured the battlefield 2 days later, he was visibly shaken. He wrote in his memoirs, "It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The Falaise pocket was not a battle. It was an industrial execution." Paul Hausser survived his wounds. He lived until 1972. He wrote memoirs. He defended the reputation of his troops, but he never truly escaped the corridor of death. In his private moments, he surely understood the lesson that had been burned into him that day. The German army had bet everything on the concept of the Übermensch, the superior soldier, the superior will, the superior tactical genius. They believed that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. But on August 20th, 1944, the United States Army proved them wrong. They didn't beat Hausser with better tactics. They didn't flank him with brilliance. They beat him with a slide rule. They beat him with a logistic chain that stretched from Detroit to Normandy. They beat him with a system that could deliver 3,000 shells to a single point in space and time, without a second of hesitation. The time-on-target barrage was the ultimate expression of the American way of war. Impersonal, scientific, and absolutely overwhelming. Hausser learned, at the cost of his army and his own blood, that in the age of industrial warfare, courage is just a variable in a physics equation. And against the math of the US Army, the value of that variable was zero.
Thank you for watching the audio. Please subscribe to the channel to listen to more about other World War II military campaigns. Thank you so much.